Sukuna Kaisen has been in effect for over a year, with Chapter 223 being named the Inhuman Makio Shinjuku Showdown Part 1. I'm going to shorten that to Shinjuku Showdown for my sanity. We've since gotten 40 consecutive chapters of fighting. These can be broken up in various ways, with most people considering the fights to be the following: Gojo vs Sukuna, Sukuna vs Kashimo, Hakari vs Uraume, Takaba vs Kenjaku, and then the subsequent Sukuna raid, in which everyone just keeps jumping Sukuna one after the other and sometimes all at once. For the sake of this video, I'll be sticking with the first 4 fights, then breaking up Sukuna raid into the following segments: Yuji and Higuruma, which will be chapters 244 to 248, Yuji and Yuta during chapters 249 to 251, Maki and Kusakabe from chapters 252 to 254, Geto's family in chapters 255 and 256, Yuji's awakening through chapters 257 to 259, and finally Yuji, Todo, and Yuta, the most recent chapters of 259 to 263. So let's go! The strongest sorcerer in history versus the strongest sorcerer of today. Gojo vs Sukuna is in a lot of respects not only the climax of the Culling Games, but of all of Jujutsu Kaisen. As from the first few chapters in the first episode of the anime, Gojo utterly humiliated One Finger Sukuna, and shortly after Yuji asked the now infamous, "Would you lose?" In hindsight, it's easy to see that he would lose this battle as the strongest versus the strongest, as he let everyone pat his back and accepted their help to fire a 200% hollow purple, which didn't do shit, but did show he had on some level accepted he wasn't alone. Unlike Sukuna, who at this point seems to still believe he's done everything on his own strength, Gojo boldly declares that Sukuna is the challenger as he heals his arms and the showdown gets started. The warm-up was immaculate. Raw hands and choreography all for pretense, as we and they know it comes down to domain versus domain. But they simply love fighting, and with all the hatred they have for each other, they'd rather just get some steam off before things get real. Sukuna wins the first clash due to his style of domain countering conventional domains. Then Gojo pulls out new Shadow style to get back to hands and destroys Malevolent Kitchen with red. Then in the second domain clash, which for comparison a prodigy like Mahito can only use domain once a week, Gojo instantly switched his conditions for defense against Kitchen, taking it back to hands again, until he realizes Sukuna switched the sure hit effect off to overpower Infinite Void, to which Gojo pulls out Falling Blossom emotion to counter it. Gojo pulls out his domain again, shrinking it to reinforce it even further thanks to his experience in Prison Realm, with them cancelling out, only for him to almost immediately go domain for domain again twice in a row, with Gojo ultimately landing Void on Sukuna, who shifts the burden of adaptation to Megami, leaving them both too drained for expansion and bringing it to Gojo 1v2ing Sukuna and Maharaga. And damn, Gege really has gotten better for making JJK, because these chapters after the Domain War are like perfect. Gege must have Malevolent Kitchen the way he cooked.
Oh brother, this guy stinks!
After some peak, we end up with Sukuna using 10 shadows to tally to form a Geto, who turns this into a 3v1, with Gojo keeping up and landing a Black Flash, taking out Agito and giving him the opening to destroy Maharaga with Hollow Purple, leading everyone watching the battle and anyone reading at home to believe Gojo had this in the bag. At the start of chapter 236, we see Gojo and Geto talking in an airport with all the characters relevant to Gojo who have died in the background, discussing Gojo's strength in relation to his loneliness. He says as much as people adored him, no one could ever understand him, with him saying he wanted on some level to reach Sukuna, but Nanami criticizes him for never really caring about saving people or upholding sorcery, only caring about his own kicks. When it comes to Gojo's characterization, I think it's too big to get into everything in detail here, but as an oversimplification, I think Gojo lost because he wasn't alone, and never really was. From Geto, Shoko, Yaga, Megami, Yuta, and Yuji, even Ijichi, Udahime, Haibara, and Nanami, he only ever viewed himself as isolated and so was contradictory, since he yearned for something he could have had. A contradiction Sukuna didn't have, as he wholeheartedly commits to and believes in the idea that he alone is the strongest. When we cut back to Gojo's corpse, we learn Sukuna used Maharaga as a blueprint for bypassing Limitless, proving his intelligence, as Gojo stated he could have won without Megami's techniques. He praises Gojo as Kashimo jumps into battle. This is such an incredible start to the final arc, which was recently confirmed by Gege himself. Even if the power scaling around Gojo versus Sukuna is a little questionable, which there are plenty of videos on already, thematically Gojo losing is what should have happened, and with him and Geto's discussion in the airport, I think it was resolved beautifully. with the expectation that Gojo's strength would tie into the end of his development, which was strongest versus the strongest. And the resolution being handled so well, it completely sends off Gojo as a character and leaves Sukuna weakened enough that everyone jumping him makes complete sense for power scaling. The action and writing are almost perfect, S tier. Picking up the chapter Gojo died, Kashimo instantly fights Sukuna. Sukuna retrieves Kamutoke before Kashimo asks Sukuna about his strength, implying his view of trying to understand those weaker than him as an inherent aspect of strength, which Sukuna calls him out for. The action is by no means bad, but definitely not at the level the raw hands were at in Gojo vs Sukuna. We then get an explanation of his ability, which describes him as controlling and using electromagnetic waves. While this is a power scaling topic, it is a flaw in the writing that the speeds used are so vastly different from the Mach 1 and 3 statements made in reference to Shibuya and Culling Games characters. But seeing as how Maki already performed an outlier feat, which Gege calls out, it does present an inconsistent story, which is a flaw of writing. Sukuna then uses Kamotake to incarnate himself, restoring his body like with the reverse curse technique. After flexing on Kashimo, Sukuna tells him he's just like Yorozu and Gojo, telling him he's preaching about what he doesn't know, saying he knows the answer but won't accept it, calling him strong before killing him with the world-cutting slash. In the afterlife, Kashimo remembers being told those who challenge the strongest seek recognition and validation, with Sukuna saying that lamenting the solitude this creates makes Kashimo greedy, before calling himself apart from Kashimo, Gojo, and Yorozu, the chapter ending with Yuji and Higuruma landing next to Sukuna. The power scaling is contradictory to itself, that being the story, and making it so Sukuna is healed undoes a lot of the hard lifting Gojo vs Sukuna did to make everyone else standing a chance make sense. Kind of a bad set of chapters, but thematically it picks up right where Gojo vs Sukuna ended, reinforcing that Gojo viewed his strength in the light he did because of his desire to be with those he saw as below him, which is why people like Kashimo and him can't measure up to Sukuna, who only calls those below him different flavors to devour. I'm not gonna lie, if I weren't a nerd-ass power scaler loser, this fight would be S tier for the character writing, but even at the basic choreography is kind of lacking too. Especially considering Kashimo is a brawler who can do whatever he wants with lightning, it's very underwhelming right after Gojo vs Sukuna. A tier. So, this fight isn't concluded yet, and even from what we have, the only thing to analyze ties back to Sukuna, so I'll be talking about it during a later part. Just going off what we know, this fight is some mid, and we don't even know what's happening in terms of the fight, only that Uraume spent his screen time glazing Sukuna. C tier. Now chat, give me a chance. This fight is a perfect send-off to Kenjaku as a player in the story. While this is widely hated by the greater fanbase, I actually think Sukuna vs Kashimo is the reason people hate this fight. Because, okay, imagine reading the peak that is Gojo vs Sukuna, and then immediately Kashimo, this hyped up bronze medal of the verse, jumps in, gets bodied, Sukuna heals the damage Gojo did, and then it cuts to a comedic fight between Takaba and Kenjaku. I would have been pissed week to week too, but I was able to read this fight all at once with hindsight when I went through it the first time, which made me like it a lot more. Kenjaku starts the chapter by beating up some randoms, then Takaba appears, and in typical villain fashion, Kenjaku tries spouting that, "I'm really not interested in you anymore," evil-ass monologue, and Takaba digs himself out of the dirt, leaving Kenjaku stunned, ultimately acknowledging Takaba as an opponent. Then the next chapter starts with flashbacks, so we have to discuss this now. The entire pace of Shinjuku Showdown is built around a specific formula. A character enters a fight, they do something unexpected, there's a flashback that explains how it makes sense, they get hyped up, then they lose or deal a slight amount of damage to Sukuna. This is known as the Sukuna cycle, and as a hot take, I think it's fine for this cycle to exist, but I do have a problem with the backstory element. This is done entirely to give Gege the freedom chapter to chapter to make up the story as it goes on, which is fine, plenty of brilliant manga could do this, but it's extremely hit or miss when it happens. In this fight, it just explains why Takaba got chosen to fight Kenjaku, which isn't really necessary, when Kenjaku immediately figures out how his powers work, and if anything, the flashback hurts the flow of the story, since it cuts off right when Kenjaku starts explaining it. In this case, it would be fine to cut out the flashback and the story wouldn't change. It's worthless. This is case by case, but in general, it feels more like a crutch Gege has given himself so he can retroactively make characters training in the 1 month time skip have all the payoff with no build up. it usually feels like the author going, oh no, this thing that had no build-up is like totally fine to be cool. Here's why. Whereas all these flashbacks condensed into a training arc could have built everything up naturally, with all the payoffs feeling more natural. An example being Yuji's convergence. If we had seen that Yuji could do steps 2 and 3 in the training arc but failed to master it in time, then mid-battle Chozo gives Yuji step 1, it would have had the same impact as it does now, but it wouldn't need a weird little paragraph or text in the middle of the action to explain why Yuji can only do steps 2 and 3. So it would flow better, with the same impact, and feel more satisfying since we didn't need to expect Yuji to use convergence after failing to learn it. Next chapter opens up with another flashback, showing Takaba's backstory. As a lonely kid who wanted to make friends, he tried too hard to overcompensate and ended up being laughed at instead of making friends. With his lack of coworkers and audience feeding into his lonely life and warping the way he looks at comedy, him admitting he didn't confront comedy the right way to avoid being hurt. He says that even if 99 people laugh, he'd be unsatisfied it wasn't 100, notably forcing Kenjaku's internal monologue to shift to make the chapter funnier, which I did find hilarious. The next chapter starts with an overly edgy special grade curse getting summoned by Kenjaku just to get hit by a bus, which leads to Kenjaku playing along with comedian, running through goofy skits with Takaba all chapter until he eternally monologues that he's slowly losing the battle since the damage he's taking is real, meaning he needs to defeat him with something other than violence. The two take the stage and deliver a back-and-forth stand-up comedy set, until it's curtains, where Yuta catches Kenjaku off guard with Todo's help and decapitates him. Kenjaku states his will be passed on, then changes the rules of the cooling games and makes Sukuna capable of continuing the merger. I personally relate to Takaba very heavily, being a loser who finds themselves funny, trying to make it in the world, which might be influencing this, but I enjoyed the character writing heavily, and thematically it's entirely isolated to these two's fight. So that's all there is to say for this. I will add that I find it very fitting that Kenjaku, someone who began the merger purely out of curiosity, was defeated by someone with a power he'd never seen before. Something completely out of left field. For me, the humor works, the power scale is fine since Takaba's a borderline gag character, and the character writing is perfect. I would put this in A tier, this being the gatekeeper from anything that isn't quite peak. After the chapters dedicated to Kenjaku, we cut to, you guessed it, a flashback explaining how Judge Man's lawyer powers work. And they do a lot of yapping to basically say Sukuna can't be charged for his crimes because he committed a lot of crimes that aren't punishable by death, which would make his domain a waste. Then Higuruma and Yuji force Sukuna into a retrial, and Sukuna confesses to speed up the process, but unfortunately Sukuna outplanned them, and Judge Man confiscated Kamutake. Chozo, Ino, and Kusakabe all get bodied with Sukuna quartering Higuruma, where he thinks back to his conversation about being unable to look Yuji in the eyes anymore, strengthening that he's not afraid to die in this battle if it earns him atonement, in his eyes at least. Sukuna then hypes Higuruma as someone at his level of genius, then throws shade at Yuji, and tears Higuruma apart to force him to learn ICT, before Higuruma looks Yuji in the eyes and entrusts the executioner's sword to him before dying. Sukuna then monologues to himself about being disappointed Higuruma didn't do more, giving us the speech about only using other people for entertainment, and admits something inside him has changed because of Yuji's indomitable ideals. He vows to crush them before Kenjaku's rule takes effect and Yuta arrives. With the heavier work done to build up Higuruma in his Cooling Games battle, this fight completes his journey excellently, showing Higuruma's willingness to defend others doesn't waver even once his own life gets put on the line, having been given the resolve to fight because of Yuji reminding him why he started. Even though he died, he passes on his executioner sword to Yuji, the most blatant case of putting the fight in his hands. And Sukuna admitting something has changed about him because of Yuji is tied back into the loneliness of strength theme, with Yuji being someone weak who stayed true to his ideals while Sukuna is someone strong who finds himself contradicting those ideals he stated. All in all, dope-ass fight, clean action, good character writing, and building on the pre-established themes of the arc. This is a certified S-tier fight, even higher than Gojo vs Sukuna. At least for me, because of Higuruma's redemption. Now, whether or not we chain this to the previous part is subjective, but it wouldn't change what I would say about it, which is why I decided to make it its own section. The fight starts with Yuta admitting going after Kenjaku was selfishness caused by not wanting Gojo to have to kill Geto's body again, and confirming that Sukuna is still nerfed from Gojo as his RCT is only now recovering. He activates his domain, Senbon Sakura Kageyoshi, and Yuji starts nerfing Sukuna by aiming for the soul to weaken his hold on Megami. There's an extremely tight exchange of blows in the infamous We Cheated panel, which leads to the pressure keeping up until Yuta lands Jacob's Ladder, and this is where my entire respect of an entire character was lost. Megami on his hands and knees after everyone fought so hard to give him the chance to fight, and his bitch ass is trying to summon Maharaga again and saying he's had enough. I've had enough, Megami. This fight ends with Maki backstabbing Sukuna, which is tough as hell, unlike Megami. The reason this is its own fight is because Yuji's true narrative moment against Sukuna is later, and Yuta's most defining moment is also much later, which I'm sure you already know what that is. I'm also just gonna keep it real. I didn't want Megami to drag down Higuruma, so yeah. In reality, we just get some clean fighting and Megami being a little piss brat. Not much to chew into, but it's easy on the eyes. B tier. Maki's fight against Sukuna is an interesting one. Since so many people look down on Maki for her abilities, it's a pleasant surprise to me that he recognized her as a real threat and philosophical enemy. It starts with her waiting for Yuta to be defeated to land a surprise attack on Sukuna, one that keeps him hurt due to her having the soul split katana. With Yuji down to heal, Maki takes on Sukuna in some raw clashes for a chapter straight, with Ino distracting Sukuna long enough for Kusakabe to sneak up with Nanami's curse tool. This chapter started with everyone hyping up Kusakabe as the strongest grade 1, and then once he does, Maki takes back over, with the narrator stating she was the entree to the appetizers of Kashimo, Higuruma, and Yuta had prepared him for. Which, like, damn, that's some cold-ass writing. Sukuna then goes on to say that Maki denies the very reason of sorcery, and that she was the first to place a roll upon him, with him unleashing a black flash on her and leaving Kusakabe alone to face Sukuna while everyone is down. Sukuna toys with him before his flashback, where everyone calls him a good guy. Back to the fight, Kusakabe unleashes his ultimate, which Sukuna kinda just chats through. He tells himself that he has to try because Yaga died, and his students would die, pushing through for all their sake. Fortunately, Miguel shows up to save the day. Toshi Fushiguro has been a pivotal figure in the world of Jujutsu Kaisen, being stated by having his heavenly pact that he has broken free of fate and irreparably altered the course of the Jujutsu world. In a lot of ways, Maki is incarnation of Toji, and so Sukuna acknowledging this type of fighter as not only one of the strongest, but someone who forced a roll upon him, shows Sukuna, in whatever way that may be, is trying to truly crush her without looking down on her just for existing, but as a threat. Seeing as how Maki and Toji's goals were to prove themselves that they were as strong as they had wanted to be, this is the culmination of Maki's awakening and my sacrifice. That more than just getting revenge against the Zenin, she's now one of the strongest. Kusakabe is more directly spelled out in the manga, but that doesn't make his selflessness any less touching. The execution is incredible and that's what matters. These few chapters are goated. I'd consider Toji and Maki's culmination Kusakabe stancing up on an Amp Sukuna S tier, honestly. Below Gojo vs Sukuna, but still great. Miguel shows up and saves Ui, posing on this wall like he's Batman or something, with the narrator saying he's the one who went toe-to-toe with Satoru Gojo. After that, there's, you guessed it, a flashback explaining why he's here. Yuta tries to convince him and fails, but Larue talks about going in order to send off Geto properly, since everyone else tried their ways and failed. Back to the fight, Miguel and Larue monologue about how all the damage everyone is landing on Sukuna has left him weakened, and then they get straight to jumping, with Miguel hitting the 1, 2, 3 weave combo before literally emoting on Sukuna. And while I don't want to dwell on this, the "is Gojo racist" flashback, which he's not, the line "I'm special because I'm me" is literally perfect. Yuji, Chozo, and Maki all try to help, but can't keep Sukuna from landing a black flash again, which makes Miguel start going, we need to get out of here. With Yuji and everyone else losing to Sukuna now, Larue really hit him with that "I got one more in me" and showed his ability to grab someone's attention, allowing Yuji to land a devious black flash and awaken. While Geto ended up in the wrong, I still do like his dynamic with his family, and I think this is a perfect last way for Geto's will to still be influencing things and somewhat help save the world. Since at the core of it all, Geto did want a world where the people he loved could be happy. With all the themes tied to Geto's characterization, which I've already discussed in my video on assimilation, it's just a nice little cherry on top of the work that the series had already done. Combined with some good action and the meme factor I experienced with everyone making fun of Miguel during it, I think this is a solid A-tier fight. With Gojo's awakening being one of the most highly regarded moments in all of animated Jujutsu Kaisen, and Maki's awakening having caught the internet on fire before, naturally everyone wanted to see what Yuji Itadori's awakening would look like, and Gege did not fumble. We cut to Uraume asking why Yuji is so strong, and Sukuna implies they should have equal potential as sorcerers. Back to the fight, they're staring each other down and Yuji proves those extra hands don't mean shit, landing 2 consecutive black flashes on Sukuna, which leads to Sukuna trying to make the fight midair, which Yuji uses to his advantage, showing us he learned cleave and cuts apart a pillar to throw as a distraction, landing a 4th black flash midair. Then we get the backstory on Ino turning Nanami's technique into a cursed tool, with him remembering Nanami trusted him the most. He unleashes Ryu, which gets negged by Sukuna, but does let Yuji get the 5-piece combo, another black flash, which even Sukuna hyping it up, saying he's chaining black flashes together like it's nothing. Back to a one-on-one, Sukuna shreds up Yuji with slashes, and Yuji eats those, closing in for number 6. Yuji dodges a stray and gets off number 7. Sukuna loses his temper and starts screaming at Yuji, calling him a brat, before Ino throws Nanami's tool into his neck, opening him up for number 8, with the narrator saying, "Don't just rival the king, surpass him." You know, there's a rumor Gege hates Yuji, but no author that hates their main character could make him this raw. It's simply impossible. Gege has said his writing process is very spur of the moment consistently, and it feels like he just gets on the ball sometimes, like he landed Black Flash inking those pages. Yuji forced Sukuna to open up Malevolent Kitchen again, and shows he finally got a domain answer, having learned new shadow style from Kusakabe. He slows down the slashes and heals the ones that do land with RCT, forcing Sukuna to pull out his maximum technique, Fuga. Chozo steps in and uses his blood to protect Yuji, with a send-off talking about how he felt he failed Yuji, with Yuji telling him he did what he could and that it was plenty. We get Chozo's death, which shakes Yuji's resolve when it's time to fight Sukuna again. With Todo showing up to help, he reminds Yuji that everyone is likely okay, and the chapter ends primed for a Todo and Yuji jumping. With Chozo's responsibilities as a brother already set up in Shibuya and strengthened during Yuki vs. Kenjaku, his death is more of a touching moment meant to test Yuji, and unlike in Shibuya where Yuji was fully ready to give up after Nobara, this time he was still standing. And while this is just a prediction, I think there will be a third moment where Yuji has to believe things will be okay on his own, surviving until someone else shows up, which I think would complete Yuji's journey nicely. Yuji's awakening is something that contrasts Gojo's awakening perfectly to me. Whereas Gojo literally says he isn't even angry over Riko in that battle, here Yuji never has some self-absorbed inner monologue. He just continues to lock in and get to work. I also think Ino assisting in the middle of his awakening works well, since Gojo's awakening further split him from Geto and reinforced his weird elitist isolation mindset of strength. Yuji never tells Ino to stop or laments needing help, he just continues giving it his all and fights Sukuna. Thematically, Yuji's awakening at this point in the game is literally a culmination of the story. Gojo's desire to connect with those he saw as below him weakened Sukuna to the point everyone could jump him. Geto's will to change the world in Larue distracted Sukuna long enough for Yuji to land Black Flash and awaken. Ino assisting in the Black Flash combo literally carries Nanami curse technique and his curse tool. Higuruma passed on his resolve to protect people again thanks to Yuji and sealed Kamutake. Hakari helped by stalling Uraume so he couldn't intervene, and Yuji cooked. While some Chozo fans are sad he never got a hype moment, I think it's because Yuki vs. Kenjaku is good enough for Chozo, and giving him a moment where he and Yuji say goodbye as brothers is good enough for me. I'm a Chozo fan, by the way, and I think this works. Overall, this is the height of this arc for me. Top of the list, S tier. With the story hyping another Jump Jutsu Kaisen between bruzzes, 260 heavily disappointed when I read it for the first time week to week, as Todo's reintroduction to the story is handled in flashbacks and interrupted by Gojo hype. Todo fainting Sukuna with Mace Crow so Yuji could land Black Flash number 9 was cool, but overall it felt really lame to explain away Todo getting Boogie Woogie back with a Viper Slap, especially since it actually ended up amping him, which retroactively makes the Mahito fight less meaningful. And then we have Yuta and Gojo's body. This tore apart the internet when it dropped, and I still dislike it so much, but it does make sense. This is also one of the only points in the story where I think the concept being shown in flashbacks enhances the story, since this is supposed to be like a what the hell is wrong with Yuta moment. Everyone tells Yuta him risking his life by inhabiting Gojo's body is wrong, and that they care too much about him for it, which makes Yuta snap and ask if Gojo wasn't important, and that he's done pushing the burden of being a monster onto Gojo alone. The flashback then hypes up Yuta's potential as more than Gojo's, and ends with Gojo murdering the higher-ups of Jujutsu Society, saying he'll catch up to Geto. After clashing domains with Sukuna, Yuta gets pieced up by Sukuna inside the clash, and in the next chapter gets cooked by Sukuna until Inumaki bails him out so he can fire purple. Then Yuji, Todo, and Yuta jump out of the smoke to get Sukuna, but Yuta falls face first into the dirt. Yuji and Todo then immediately pick up Yuta's slack and start firing Yuji's dismantles at the barrier between Megami and Sukuna's souls, using Sukuna's expectations of Boogie Boogie to leave him open for Hana's Jacob ladder, which many are hoping to end the Sukuna cycle. To dig into what this fight meant, it represents even more strongly the ultimate failure of Satoru Gojo as the strongest. Gojo, in his way of viewing himself as the strongest, created the gap between him and his friends, becoming monster-like. Yuta recognizes this, but ultimately fails to see why Gojo failed, as instead of choosing not to become a monster, he views it as a responsibility one must take on. Gojo could never defeat Sukuna because he was conflicted. As I highlighted earlier, he really wanted to be with those people he viewed as below him. Yuta similarly cares even more for Gojo than he did for Yuta, stating his fight with Kenjaku was born out of a selfish desire to prevent Gojo from feeling that pain of killing his best friend a second time. As oversimplified as it sounds, Yuta was never going to win against Sukuna going into the fight as a monster, because there is no greater monster than Sukuna, which is why Yuji and Todo are still fighting, because Yuji never became a monster in his pursuit to help and save people. His humanity is what made Nanami trust him in his final moments. His humanity is what made Nobara able to smile when she died. His humanity made Chozo pass on not as a curse, but as a brother. His humanity made Higuruma remember where he came from, to die looking Yuji in the eye as another human once again, redeeming him from the murderer he had become. With Jacob's Ladder weakening the connection for Yuji to reach Megami again, I believe his humanity will help spur on Megami. And I think a Naruto and Obito style punch in the face telling him to fight could end the Sukuna style amazingly. While Yuta being a fraud does kinda suck, I think there is some good hand-to-hand, and the background of everyone in the story continuing to misunderstand Gojo is solid writing. The only issue for me being the power scaling and week-to-week experience, which drags us down to A tier for me. In the future, maybe with full hindsight, this fight could be goated, but more than others, we have to know what happens next to know if it was meaningless or not. That was a lot. So here's the full ranking. Hakari vs Uraume is the worst fight in C tier. Yuji and Yuta a tier above that, with Sukuna and Kashimo a tier above those. Then Geto's family, Yuji, Todo, and Yuta, and Takaba vs Kenjaku all in A tier. Ending with Maki and Kusakabe, Gojo vs Sukuna, Yuji and Higurumi, then Yuji's Awakening in S tier. If you think I got anything wrong about the narrative of Jujutsu Kaisen, tell me so I can learn. If you would change the ranking, even if you don't disagree with me, tell me why. If you have your own video on the topic, tell me so I can react to it on stream. Bye bye!